Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be joining us in the world. I'm Fred Plotkin. This is Fred Plotkin on Fridays, where we talk about inspiration, about music, about ideas in a way that I hope is meaningful and provocative for the listener. As you know, I always select a guest who I find deeply inspiring. That's the point of departure. And Clive Gillinson, I've not said this to you directly, Clive, but is one of the people I find most inspiring in the world. And it's been that way for about 15 years. And I mean that sincerely. We tend to meet once or twice a year, usually at the announcement of the new season of Carnegie Hall. And I don't know if Clive has noticed, by the way, he's the executive director and CEO and artistic director of Carnegie Hall, that you often give me the first question to ask you once you open up to questions after presenting the season. Do you do that because you think you'll get an easy question, or I'll send you off on a good tangent that you can then go with?
Well, it's always interesting to talk to people who you know are really knowledgeable. I'm not trying to flatter you, but at least, I know that whatever your question is, it will be about something really substantive and that we'll have a good conversation. But Fred, I just wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me to join you today as well.
Thank you. You are the first non-singer conductor that I've had. Clive, as I said, is executive director. He's also an outstanding cellist, and we're going to talk about the cello. That's your cello behind you, I would assume. Is that correct?
Yes.
So very briefly, you were born March 7th of 1946 in Bangalore, India. Are you tired of people referring to Clive of India in talking about you?
I think it's probably where I got my name from, because I was born there. But one of the things that amused me most when I joined Carnegie Hall, which I loved actually, because it implied that Carnegie Hall really matters around the world, is that one of the phone calls I got after I'd been appointed, and it was in the press, was, this is the Bangalore Times, and we want to do a front page spread on Bangalore boy takes over Carnegie Hall. Mm-hmm. And so I said, well, look, to be absolutely honest, I only lived there for the first few months of my life. And they said, well, we don't care. We'll take credit for anything. So it even mattered in Bangalore.
Well, Vivian Lee was born in India as well. And always like to say that she was born in India. You were in Kenya for a while and moved to Britain. Your mother, was it pronounced Regina? Tell me the correct pronunciation of her first name. Regina, that's what I thought. Was a professional cellist, your father a businessman who loved writing and art and so on. And at age 11, you began to study the cello. Was it with your mother or with someone else?
No, I was at boarding school. So we had a teacher who came to the school. So there was no choosing the teacher, because this was the cello teacher who came to that school.
And were you given that instrument, or was it suggested to you by someone else, or did you want the cello?
Well, my mother had insisted from the age of 7 that I learn the piano. I had no talent. I hated it. I persisted, or she persisted. I kind of persisted for about 3 years or so, but I always knew I wanted to play the cello. Now, I have no idea whether that was because she was a wonderful cellist, which she was. But I think for me, frankly, it always was that it was the voice I loved, the cello. And, I still think it's the most beautiful instrument of any. And, and it very much correlates to the human voice as well. And so in the end, she gave in and she allowed me to learn the cello at the age of 11.
And I'm not going to talk too much about your education, your period in between. I'm going to fast forward. You were in the National Youth Orchestra in the UK. And I think that's a very important detail that we're going to get back to later, because of the role of education and early music connection, I think is a good word, for people and how it influences and affects their whole lives. You joined the London Symphony in the cello section in 1970. And would you talk about how the London Symphony Orchestra runs itself, which many people may not know?
Well, the 4 major London orchestras, the London Symphony, the London Philharmonic, Royal Philharmonic, and the Philharmonia, are all what is called self-governing. The players are the shareholders. The players elect at least part of the board from amongst themselves. And so they're very involved. I mean, they don't actually run it, but they are very involved. I mean, the whole way it's run has also changed. When the London Symphony Orchestra was created in 1904, they totally ran themselves. You know, it was a bit much more like the Vienna Philharmonic, except the Vienna Philharmonic, the reason it can operate that way is it is not a full-time orchestra. I mean, they're basically the orchestra of the opera, and then they create this orchestra for part of the time. But the London Symphony, when it was created, was self-governing totally. The players did everything and managed it. But as time went by, it evolved firstly towards them having a manager, a professional manager, and then ultimately bringing more and more outside people, which was really in the time I was there. When I joined, it was only players on the board. By the time I'd left, there were a very significant number of outsiders on the board. So it has changed, and it's changed along with the realization that the arts has to be run as a professional business, which it was not in those days. I mean, it was much more of a cottage industry. And, you know, it's become more and more professional. It's become more and more necessary to have outside expertise represented on the boards.
There's something I'd like you to explain, and if I am mistaken in my assumption, please correct me. Many of our listeners are all over the world and grew up in different systems in terms of funding for the arts and support of the arts. In the United States, it's largely a philanthropic model with just dribs and drabs from the government, although in certain places such as New York City and New York State, it's more generous in many parts of the country. In many European countries, especially Austria, Finland, Germany, France, there is a great deal of generosity on the part of the government and a belief in supporting the arts. And would you say that the United Kingdom is a bit of a mixed model in that there maybe historically was more government funding, but they gradually have transitioned to something of a hybrid?
Well, I've always felt there's lots of things in which Britain kind of sits mid-Atlantic. And I'd say it does on this issue as well. There's very substantial, by American standards, there's very substantial public funding, but it's something like 15 to 30% for most organizations that are funded by the government, which is through the Arts Council. That's the arm of government that funds them. But also some, and many organizations actually get funding from their city, from their local government as well. But it means, you know, that takes it up to probably 30, not more, certainly not in the music area. You know, whereas, for instance, when I started in management, the Berlin Philharmonic was, I think, 90% funded by the government, and a lot of particularly German, Austrian arts organizations, but also France, many others, have very, very substantial amounts of public funding. So in Britain, we had to develop a mixed economy, and we had to raise sponsorship, we had to do fundraising in lots of different ways, but nothing like at the level of America or with the professionalism of America.
What are the advantages and disadvantages of the three, let's call them three different models, in terms of, not just in terms of being able to put on a season and attract an audience, but artistically? Well,
I mean, let me start with Britain, since that's where I grew up, you know, where a substantial amount comes from government. One of the interesting things there that we found on an ongoing basis was if it's government that is funding the arts, in general, people from government don't want to make mistakes. You only lose your job if you make a mistake. You don't particularly gain huge plaudits if you take a big risk, spend money and it succeeds. If it fails, you're in trouble and you may well be out of a job. So there's a tendency, there certainly was in Britain, there was a tendency for public funding to lead towards safety rather than risk, you know, which is completely antithetical to what the arts should be about. But the reason the arts are so dynamic and so vivid in Britain and imaginative is largely because of the people. It is not because of the system. It's almost despite the system, which pushes towards the safe rather than pushing towards risk. But there's a lot of extraordinary arts managers, very visionary people who've led the arts in Britain to be extraordinary. So there's always that danger. Now, when you look more broadly across Europe with much higher levels of funding, I mean, the huge advantage of that is what actually comes in through the box office has much less impact than it does in Britain, and certainly than it does in America. So technically, it allows people to take greater risks. So, whether they do or not, obviously, is their choice. But the biggest difference is very noticeable when you come to times of crises. I remember in 2008, I'd been here for a few years, and we had the huge financial crisis. And we had to cut our budget by 20% within a very, very quick time. We had to completely transform our business. I talked to my friends in London, and the Arts Council gave everybody more money to help them to get through. Here, you're on your own. And if you don't respond to what happens in the market, then you're gone. So, I mean, this is a much, much more ferocious environment in that way. It's totally down to what you do. But the huge strength of the American model is, and what I love, is if I go to a donor, if I go to a sponsor, if I go to a foundation, if I go with a good idea that's sound, solid, there's no way I'm going to capture their imagination. Here, every idea, essentially, you're having to capture one person's imagination as to whether that's where they want their money to go. And they've got to be really excited and thrilled. So the lens through which we look at everything at Carnegie Hall, which is the lens I've always tried to look through, when we're looking at planning, is to create things almost that the world can't live without. It's got to be so exciting and so important that it has to happen. So when you go and talk to people, they say, my God, I've got to be part of this. That's how they've got to feel. And the American model pushes you towards that. I mean, obviously that should come from within anyway, but it does support that. But as I said, it's infinitely more exposed and vulnerable.
I'm going to ask you a basic logistical question before I go further. In my work in opera, we often plan out 5 years ahead. In my work in opera houses in Italy, it's sometimes 6 months ahead. When I worked at La Scala, there was one time when we had a soprano, a tenor, and a baritone, and a wonderful conductor, Claudio Botto. And we said, shall we do Tosca or Traviata tonight? And the soprano said, I feel like doing Tosca. Okay, we're doing Tosca. And those were the sets that were brought out. And the spontaneity of that and the artistic assurance, it was hardly phoned in, was thrilling. But it occurred to me that was my DNA was formed a bit there and a bit at the Lyric Opera of Chicago before coming home to New York. But when I came home to New York and found this planful method where you would think years ahead, it was a whole other experience. At Carnegie Hall, what is the time frame?
It's between, well, it's different for different sorts of music, to say first. So on the classical music area, we're planning anything between 2.5 and 4 years ahead. With jazz, world music, if you spoke to a jazz artist or a world music artist and said, we want to engage you in 3 years' time, they'd say, don't be ridiculous. I haven't a clue what I'm going to be doing in 3 years' time. So they won't even have a conversation. But if you're going to get, in classical music, if you're going to get the greatest artists and put together the projects that really matter, where you've got to bring together partnerships, you've got to do things which are much broader, you need the time frame, which also means that when something like 2008 strikes or now COVID, it means you're planned way ahead, you're committed way ahead. And so trying to change all of that planning is pretty traumatic. I mean, both for the organization, but also for all the artists you work with. But, we've gone more and more towards big project planning, as you know, Fred, from following us. And so our big festivals take a long time to put together. I mean, we're bringing together dance, theater, literature, film. So it's not just about music and what we present in the hall. We're creating partnerships throughout the city to create these journeys of exploration for our audiences. So all of that takes a long time to plan. And, you have to be very strategic about it. And if you try and put it together at the last minute, you simply are not going to achieve all the objectives and make the greatest possible project.
In fact, I'm going to talk to you in detail about the festivals, but I want to give our listeners a bit of basic information about Carnegie Hall, because the perception, of course, is that it's this august music hall on 57th Street and 7th Avenue in Manhattan. It opened on May 5th of 1891. And Dvorak, Tchaikovsky, a lot of the great composers of the time performed there. And originally it was called Carnegie Hall. Now there are spaces known as the Stern Auditorium, which is the main auditorium, which has 2,804 seats. There is Zankel Hall, which is a more flexible space of about 600 seats. And there's Weil Hall, which has 268 seats. I, being a native New Yorker who grew up running around Carnegie Hall, I still call it Carnegie Hall. Zankel, I do say it properly, but I remember when that was a cinema. And Weil Hall, to me, it's an elegant, beautiful, small space. To me, has always been Carnegie Recital Hall. And many of our great artists of today and of the past began not on the main stage, but in Carnegie Recital Hall, Weil Hall. Right now, you do 170 performances a year, not just of so-called classical music. There are orchestral concerts, solo recitals, chamber music, vocal music, opera and concert, but also jazz, gospel, all types of music. And when people look at this very beautiful theater, to me, it's not the most opulent theater, but it's the most beautiful for its sobriety in a way. What they don't realize, if they're not New Yorkers, is that Carnegie Hall, more than any space I know in New York City, has always been, and certainly even more under you, the most welcoming theater I know anywhere. And as children, we were brought there. And not just because my mom worked there. Every New York City child got to go to Carnegie Hall. I was part of the New York City All-City Choir. And we got to sing on the stage of Carnegie Hall when I was a kid. And I actually sang a solo by Edvard Grieg. And you never forget that. You never forget looking at that gorgeous space. I've had the honor, thank you, to be able to speak on the stage several times. And it's so embracing. Just the architecture of the place, the way it curves around. And every musician I know and speaker who's been on the stage has said the same thing. When I come out there, I always pause and take a breath, not out of nerves, but to really absorb the space. So we New Yorkers hold it very dear. We nearly lost it in 1960 to a wrecking ball, and I'm going to ask you to talk about Isaac Stern a bit later. But it's a very special place, going beyond just musical achievement, although that's the thing it's most known for. I will also say to you, Clive, I never have, there is no ushering staff in the world that is more welcoming and loving than the staff at Carnegie Hall. And I've worked in other theaters, and there's just nothing like them. And they're proud of the hall, but it's not an arrogance. I've worked in certain opera houses in Europe where they're very, they deign to let you into the door. Whereas at Carnegie Hall, you are welcomed. And half the staff, I mean, the ushers, greet me. They know me. They say, oh, you know where your seat is. It's E2, isn't it? And yes, of course, it is E2. I have 4 subscriptions. On one of my subscriptions, it's been E2 for the past 41 years. And I'm always made welcome, and without fail. And part of the experience of Carnegie Hall is the sense of openness in what otherwise could seem like a forbidding place. Did I leave anything out in that regard about the experience of Carnegie Hall for people who come there?
I completely agree with everything you said. I mean, I think the staff are absolutely wonderful. They're so proud and they love the place. They feel such a sense of responsibility towards the hall. But you're absolutely right. I think most people assume we're classical music. They don't realize the breadth of the music we do. But in addition to that, they assume we're just about performance, and they don't realize as well, most people, that we have a vast education program, which I'm sure we'll come on to and talk about later. But we reach about 800,000 people a year, most of whom are kids, and that's all around the country as well. So Carnegie Hall is much, much bigger than just these extraordinary spaces. And I mean, you referenced the cinema, because in fact it was built originally as three halls, three concert halls. And the big one, Isaac Stern Auditorium, and the little one, Weill Recital Hall, are amongst the greatest in the world. And so this guy who had never built a concert hall in his life before, who happened to be the treasurer of the choral society in which Louise Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie's wife, sang, that was the only basis on which they appointed him. And, you know, and he knew nothing. They sent him around Europe to look at the greatest concert halls and copy something. He came back, built something that bore no relationship to anything he'd seen, and he built two of the greatest concert hall in the world. And one of the things that's completely and utterly baffling to me is that the third one, which now is Zankel Hall, was totally and utterly useless. So how did somebody build two of the greatest and one of the worst? And so it became a cinema because it wasn't really usable as a concert hall. And only in 2003 was they blasted down into the bedrock to create a space where you could have the right volume of sound for it to actually work as a concert hall. So it's only been a concert hall in that way, but it's become so vital to us because it is a contemporary concert hall, which gives us much more flexibility around different sorts of music and amplification and all of these things which allow our offerings to be so much more diverse.
And my seat in that hole is C21.
Okay.
I like subscribers, and I believe in the subscription model, although people are saying it's passé. Being a subscriber provides a sense of not ownership, but belonging and connection, and the desire to want to see that flourish. I don't know if you ever came across a man in Chicago named Danny Newman, who for many years worked at the Lyric Opera Chicago, and he was one of my teachers. And he was the master of the so-called subscription model and movement. Do subscriptions really have a place? I won't say really. Do subscriptions have a place, or are younger people just not willing to commit that way?
Well, look, I mean, the reality of life today is people do not want to plan as far ahead as they used to. I mean, if we're selling subscriptions, we go on sale at the end of January for September through June the following year. So nearly 18 months ahead, one is buying tickets. So the answer is a lot of people still want to. We sell pretty well 50% of our tickets on subscriptions still. But we all know that is going to continue to reduce because of, you know, the younger generation simply not wanting to make commitments that far out. But it does mean a lot to a lot of people. Not only they have their seat, but they know the people around them as well. They arrange their seating so they're sitting with friends and they're actually able to share the concert with people they know and like. So it has all sorts of implications like that. I'll just tell you one slightly amusing side, which is that Danny Newman is the reason I'm in management. And that is because when we moved with the London Symphony Orchestra to the Barbican Centre, the manager at the time set up a subscription, because subscriptions didn't exist in London up to that point, because there's so many orchestras, you really can't capture people's loyalty in the same way. You know, American orchestras tend to be the only major orchestra in their city. So in London, he thought, well, now we've got our own concert hall, we're going to do a subscription like the Americans. And he took on a Danny Newman subscription. Total catastrophe, because it's not down to Danny Newman, because there was no context for this. So he was just transplanting something without thinking about the marketplace in which he was transplanting it. So the LSO ended up on the verge of bankruptcy. The manager was sacked. Somebody had to go in because they couldn't find a manager. And that's how I ended up in management, because as a cellist, I was asked to go in temporarily. So Danny Newman actually got me my job.
Well, I'm glad for that. Danny was a very Chicago figure, and I love Chicago, but it's a very distinct city in terms of accent and can-do attitude and so on, and being a bit self-promotional in a good way. And he always liked to call me son, and he would always say to me, son, what do you have to teach me today? And when I was studying about subscribing, I was there learning. I was actually working for Artist Kranick, who was the general director, as her protege, whatever. And she would send me around to different departments to learn what all of these people were doing. And I thought, let me look up the origin of the word subscribe, and it's underwrite. And I said to Danny, this is not only about buying tickets, it's about underwriting, it's about a sense of participation. And he said, that's good, son, that's good. And the next press release was, help underwrite the Lyric Opera Chicago.
Congratulations.
But I'm glad that he opened the door for you in that way. I'm very glad to hear that. Talk about, if you would, going from being a performer and understanding the needs of performers, the character of performers, not that we can generalize, to managing institutions that give them the opportunity to perform.
Well, firstly, there was no intent in this. I knew as a cellist, well, my two loves were mathematics and music, and I'd originally gone to university to study math and then changed because I knew I'd made a mistake. And so I went back to music and went to the Royal Academy of Music and then on into the LSO. But I only ended up really by chance because I was clear that was never something I would have done by design. And it was only because the orchestra was on the verge of bankruptcy, I was on the board of directors, and they needed somebody because nobody applied for the job. They couldn't find anybody to run the orchestra. So they thought they'd get somebody to go in for 3 months. So those were still the days when there were no outside directors. There was very little real knowledge about running a business. And it was where the mathematics came in, incredibly useful, because it meant I could set up the financial systems, which simply didn't exist. It was impossible to try and analyze and evaluate at that time why we were losing so much money. The systems were just not in place properly. And, and I remember a few years before talking to one of the managers of the LSO, and he said to me, Clive, as long as the diary is full and we're doing, concerts, they're more or less selling, and we're doing recording work, and the players are working full time, the budgets work, it's fine. So I mean, it really was very, very relaxed, you might say. Amateur is another word. But so going in there was ferocious because I knew nothing about management. And so trying to work out, when you're on the edge of disaster, how you completely reconfigure how an organization works. I mean, the only thing I had in my favor and knew, well, I suppose two things. I mean, the mathematics was a big piece, but the biggest piece was I was an artist. I mean, that was what I'd wanted to be all my life. So in terms of talking to conductors, to soloists, to the other players, that was my language. I mean, so that was easy, in terms of the communication, not in terms of the vision. But the other side of how to create and, restructure and then create a business fit for the future, that was unbelievably hard. I mean, it was just endless sleepless nights, a lot of conversations, asking questions. I mean, it was where I acquired very quickly one of my mantras, which is questions are more important than answers. Because the fact is, going in, with no knowledge, of course you haven't got any answers. All you can do is ask every question and then try and come up with what you think at least are the best answers, not necessarily the right ones. You'll only know that in retrospect, but the best in the circumstances at the time. And so, I mean, it was a horrible time. And I mean, after 3 months, they offered me the job because they still couldn't find a manager. And I said no, because firstly, after 3 months, you've no idea if I'm the right person. And after 3 months, I've certainly got no idea whether I want to do this. So I said, I'll do it for a year, if that works. Keep my job in the cello section open, because at the end of a year, you might not want me and I might not want the job. So let's all keep our options open. So that was what we agreed. And I did it for a year. And by then, I was beginning to enjoy it. And I was beginning to love the challenge. I was beginning to love the whole thing of, how do you develop a real vision for an orchestra? And the curious thing I found, I mean, which I hadn't realized, but having played in the London Symphony for 14 years, the minute I walked in the door, without ever having consciously thought about what I wanted the orchestra to do and be, I knew what I wanted. So it was at that side of things, the decisions were actually relatively easy, because I had a very clear picture in my mind of where I thought we should be traveling. And, so there we started these huge festivals and so on. I mean, there were a lot of things that we did, which are, have some similarity. I started the education program, which didn't exist for orchestras at that time, except there was one orchestra, the London Sinfonietta, which was a chamber orchestra. But in general, that didn't exist either. So, there were certain things that I just absolutely knew in my bones, which was about program, not about running a business. The other part all had to be learned from the beginning.
I'm going to address all of that, but I have to insert parenthetically a question. Did you, at a certain point, sleep more than you did before those sleepless nights?
Yes, I did. And
did lullabies have anything to do with them?
Lullabies had nothing to do with it, no. Exhaustion had a lot to do with it.
I'll tell you why I'm asking, unless you want to talk about lullabies.
I know why you're asking. But no, I mean, the biggest thing was another learning. I mean, there's just so many things I was learning, obviously, in those early days. But one of the biggest learnings was that it's not a problem if you can't see the solution to a problem right now. Initially I thought if you can't solve it now, you'll never solve it and you've got a disaster on your hands. Bit by bit, I began to trust in our ability as a team to talk things through, work them out, and that we would come up with solutions, even if we couldn't see them now. So bit by bit, once you start to build faith that you have a team, there is a process around how you address challenges and that you will find answers, that was really why I began to start sleeping. And because we were addressing the deficit as well, because we were told, I mean, we had a deficit that for that time was huge, and a very significant part of our budget. And we were told that we had 3 years to eliminate it, or the Arts Council, our government funding, would be taken away. And years later, I discovered that the guy who gave us that condition, he wrote a note to his superiors saying, I've set this condition. There is no way they're going to be able to address that. So we'll have less of a problem because we'll have one less London orchestra. Well, we addressed it in 2 years. And then I was told about that letter when we became the best funded London orchestra. Yeah. And, because they were backing us because of our vision and what we were doing, backing us more than anybody else. So it was only then that I learned that he thought we'd never escape, from the problem. But it was really all about, as a team, if you really challenge and test and explore every problem, every idea, and you're rigorous about that, you will find solutions. And that was why I was able to start sleeping. And I started believing in what we were trying to do as well, because initially we had to do things which really were antithetical to, our artistic vision, because we just had to economize. So we were doing too few rehearsals on things. There was all sorts of economies we made in that first 9 months to a year, which were, really things I couldn't believe in. But at the same time, planning big projects for the future, which were absolutely about vision and where the LSO should be going. So there was something positive to focus on too.
I do want to explain, so our listeners don't think I'm insane, why I brought up lullabies in the middle of this interesting discussion about management and music and budgets and such. Today, as you and I are speaking live, there's also a live transmission from Carnegie Hall, even though the theater is shut right now because of COVID and so forth. Carnegie Hall has continued its engagement through its website, carnegiehall.org. And you created the Lullaby Project, which I think is a very beautiful thing. And there's a CD of some of the lullabies. Would you describe it briefly? And then I promise we'll go back to management.
I will. Just to say as context, we do a lot of social impact work, which is about really engaging with people, who tend to be people who've got real challenges, haven't had opportunities, really difficult situations in life. And that includes working up at Sing Sing prison. So there's a lot of different work we do. And one of those projects is Lullaby, where we work with young mothers or mothers-to-be, and who in one way or another might have very significant challenges. They may be homeless, they may be a single mother, there's all sorts of things, or they may be in hospital. And basically working with them to help them both to write poetry and words that are about them engaging and communicating with their baby. And then, specially trained teaching artists work with them to develop a lullaby then around that, so that, both the words and the music, which they can then sing to their babies. And this has been explosive. I mean, it's, it started out as a small project. It's now not only something we're doing with a huge number of people, but we've literally got partners all around the world doing lullabies, based on this project. I mean, firstly, all around the US, but all around the world as well. So, I mean, it's now a very, very significant part of our education programs. And again, it's something that transforms lives, just as our work in Sing Sing Prison does. And there, I mean, we're doing the same thing. It's the prisoners writing about their experiences, their hopes, their wishes, their dreams, writing music for it, and then performing it, and really giving them hope, identity, a sense of purpose, fulfilling their talent, asking questions about themselves and about life. And so there's a lot of this work. We're doing that with kids in the justice system, or kids who are in danger of going into the justice system. So this is a whole philosophy and approach, of which Lullaby is one piece.
There, for people around the world can access this, go to New York Public Radio, WNYC, and you can hear a lot of the programming about the prisoner composers and the prisoner performers, many of whom were stimulated by this project at Carnegie Hall. I know artists such as Joyce DiDonato and Eric Owens have gone to sing and work with prisoners, and I'm greatly admiring of that. Clive, one thing you may know, that I've written 6 cookbooks, but I don't think you know that one of them was a book for pregnant women about what to eat to have better outcomes of their babies. And in addition to nutrients and food and exercise and rest and so on, I incorporate music into the prenatal period and then postnatal. And my baby gift to newborn babies is a recording of music, and not Mozart for geniuses, but different kinds of music that I think mother and father and child would respond to in the earliest years, because and I gather you too, really grew up with music from the playpen, from the cradle. And I know that from the earliest moments, that if we're exposed to that as an additional language, namely music, to our spoken languages, it affects the rest of life. And therefore, I love this Lullaby project, and that's why I felt we had to address it today. Now, some people stay up for different reasons. I stayed up last night reading a book, Better to Speak of It, by Clive Gillinson and Robert Rim. And it's your philosophy to some degree, I would say, and some of your history. And I love the cover, which is half London, half New York. And it came out in 2016, but has just had an updated edition that's just come out. And I just want to read one thing that you said and then ask you about that. People succeed when they're not thinking about themselves, but are committed to contributing to others' lives. Suddenly life opens up. That was the key to my own development. In management, I found a vocation through which I could make a real contribution, where I was suddenly forced to interact, to constantly be involved with people, seeking to convince them to take journeys of exploration with us. Explain that more, please.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, when you want to be a musician, which I did, it's unbelievably self-centered. When I was a kid, I mean, the determination, I mean, getting into the National Youth Orchestra, everything was about music, but a lot of it also was about me, my ambition, my personal aspirations, and even going to the Royal Academy of Music, same thing. I mean, you're competing all the time. You want to be the best. You compete for the prizes, you compete for everything. Life really is all about you, or life's about me, is what it is. As a musician, it tends to be. And of course, it's about the music as well, but it's very, very centered around you yourself. The thing that I'd never expected when I went into management was that all of a sudden, your entire role is about how does your organization serve people. And I went from one day to the next, from being a person whose life was largely about themselves, to being a person where I was irrelevant. The whole purpose of the job was, how do we create the greatest concerts? How do we create, the most extraordinary things? They're never about you. None of these things are about you. I mean, if I think of the great artists I tried to bring into the LSO, Scholti, um, Rostropovich, all of these people who came in, Pierre Boulez, I mean, so many, Leonard Bernstein brought in as president when I was there. You know, all of these people, my job was to fulfill their vision, not my vision. The whole point of putting Bernstein on the stage, or Rostropovich or Boulez or Schalti, any of these people, is the audience want to engage with what they believe in, what those artists believe in, and what matters to them. So all of a sudden, my entire life just switched completely from one side to the other to being about how do I enable extraordinary artists to express what they believe in to other people in a way that's going to inspire and transform lives of other people. And so I only realized after a bit, the reason I was so much happier as a person and so much more enjoying my life, engaged with life, was because none of it was to do with me. And it was all about how do we use music to serve people. And, you know, and that's even true of the institution. You're not serving the institution. At Carnegie Hall, we're not serving the institution. The institution is serving people's lives. And as long as we focus on that, and it's never about us, then we're going to do a good job. If it's about us, we probably will not do a very good job. So that was the discovery, but it was only a discovery by chance. I didn't arrive at it intellectually and think I've got to change my life. I arrived at it because the job I was doing required a completely different role of me. And I suddenly realized it was, I'd been a very discontented, not a particularly happy person up to that point. My entire life has changed as well, because I find, you know, from the moment onwards, after I went into management, I realized I was much happier. I was truly engaged with life in a way that was utterly meaningful, but all because it was never about me. And so, I mean, that's really what that means. So it was the biggest accident of my life to go into management. The biggest mistake, on the face of it, because something I knew I didn't want to do, and yet it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Let's talk a bit, and then I want to go back to management ideas, about some of the music that you've recommended to listeners of IDAGIO. We're beginning with the Shostakovich Cello Concerto No. 1, Mstislav Rostropovich, the LSO, and Seiji Ozawa. Why is that?
Well, I mean, firstly, I'll try not to make the stories long. I mean, I remember Rostropovich. I've got to call him Slava because everybody called him Slava, and he is Slava. I remember him telling me about the fact that he was desperate for Shostakovich to write him a concerto, but nothing came out, nothing was done. And then suddenly he heard somewhere that Shostakovich was writing a cello concerto. And so a few weeks later, after he'd heard this, Shostakovich invited him round to his place and played him on the piano the first cello concerto. And he said to Slava, "What do you think of it?" And Slava said, "It's incredible, it's phenomenal." And he said, no, come on, tell me what you really think of it. And this went on, because Shostakovich was so insecure, this went on for a long time. And in the end, when Slava at the end convinced him that he really did love it, he said, "Well, in that case, would you do me the honor of allowing me to dedicate it to you?" And, fantastic. So they played and played. And I mean, Rostropovich went away, learned it by heart within 3 days, I think. Yeah. And they were playing it together and working on it, and they totally exhilarated. And then they called Slava's teacher to come and listen, because he thought he'd got to get him to come and hear this. So the teacher lived quite a long way away, got on a train, came. And when he arrived, they'd both been drinking vodka, and they were both completely drunk. And so what they played the teacher was just a complete shambles. And Slava said, there were bits of Saint-Saëns cello concerto, there were all sorts of stuff in there, because they were just both totally drunk. So the teacher had no idea what on earth the Shostakovich cello concerto was about. But anyway, that was the roots of it. But we did a big festival with Slava, and one of the closest people to him was Seiji Ozawa. And Seiji Ozawa would do anything with Slava. And so we did this concert at which we did the Prokofiev Symphonia Concertante and the Shostakovich Cello Concerto. And Seiji Ozawa changed all his plans to come and do it, and then it was recorded. And this is the recording. And I think the way Slava played it, but the fact that it was with Seiji, and they were, Slava always used to call Seiji his little brother, and and Slava was Seiji's big brother, and they adored each other. And in fact, even, you know, when Seiji was in Paris and heard Slava had died, he literally spent a week in bed, so upset, so depressed, he couldn't even get out of bed for a week. So this recording really also reflects that extraordinary relationship and Slava's extraordinary relationship with the LSO, which was one that I started because of his birthday, his 60th birthday.
And the Schubert Arpeggione Sonata with Rostropovich, with Slava, and Benjamin Britten performing.
Well, again, I mean, for me, it's one of the most sublime, beautiful, pure, ethereal, perfect pieces of music ever. And you just seem to be floating in heaven. And I mean, the reason that that particular recording is because the two of them together, again, that was another amazing relationship. Although initially Slava spoke almost no English, Benjamin Britten spoke almost no Russian. So they spoke in what was called Allbra Deutsch, you know, which neither, neither spoke German well, but they spoke in this German together. But ultimately they became incredibly close. Britten was a truly great pianist, and them playing it together was one of the great experiences, and, you know, one of the greatest performances you'll ever hear. But when Benjamin Britten died, Slava never played the piece again because he felt there was no other pianist he could play that with. So again, it represents an important part of history as well.
And when Britten wrote the War Requiem, he had Slava's wife, Galina Vishnevskaya, as the Russian soprano soloist. Remind me, there is a German, an Englishman, and a Russian who always sing these parts, or at least originally.
It's how it was originally intended.
I think of Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau was the German. I don't recall the Englishman, but
I can't remember originally now.
Yeah, but there's that connection too of Britten and Rostropovich and so on. Then you picked the Mozart Clarinet Concerto. No complaints from me. Clarinet was my instrument. You asked me to select the performance, and I chose the famous Benny Goodman, John Barbirolli, New York Philharmonic. Why the Mozart Clarinet Concerto?
Well, my oldest daughter was a very good clarinetist, and I remember working with her for hours on this. I mean, she played in the National Youth Orchestra as well of Great Britain. And I remember working with her, and this was the piece I just totally identify with her. I mean, she's not a clarinetist now, she runs a think tank, but she, you know, in her youth, in her teens, she actually had terrific talent, and she made a beautiful sound, which is obviously so fundamental to this piece. You know, and again, it's one of the most beautiful and perfect pieces ever written, but this is a very personal association.
I had Christine Gerke on May 1st, and her instrument was the clarinet. I didn't know that, and she picked the same piece of music. Now, the Sibelius Symphony No. 7, Leonard Bernstein, the New York Philharmonic.
Well, that's about Bernstein. I mean, the two people who've been the giants in my life, I mean, in terms of personal relationships, my admiration for them, having the unbelievable thrill of working with them, were Slava Rostropovich and Leonard Bernstein. And I remember firstly playing the cello in the orchestra with Leonard Bernstein. And I remember us doing a Sibelius symphony. In fact, it was Sibelius 5. And we did it at the Edinburgh Festival, which is 400 miles from London. And I remember us playing Sibelius 5. And then I got into my old car, I mean, a long, long time ago, a terrible old car. It's about an 8-hour drive. I drove the whole 8 hours. And I realized I arrived at the station just to see my sister off, who was going off traveling. I'd driven all overnight straight after the performance in order to see her before she left. And I realized I couldn't remember a single thing about the journey. All that I'd been doing was living this Sibelius symphony that Bernstein had opened up, because Sibelius wasn't a huge part of my life until Leonard Bernstein. I mean, now he's for me, one of the composers that means the most. And the seventh, for me, I mean, it's very rare that a composer knows what their last statement is going to be. I mean, Sibelius, after that, it felt as though he'd said everything he could say in life. And he lived for many, many more years, but he never wrote again after that. That was the last statement, and he knew that completed everything he had to say as an artist. And working on that music with Bernstein and the insight he would bring to it was one of the greatest experiences of my life.
I teach Sibelius a lot. It happens to be another love of mine. Everything Finnish I happen to love. And so I've traveled in Finland a lot, and it's a very particular sound and sound world. I'll just say to you parenthetically before we go on, the bookcase I'm looking at now, I have a Leonard Bernstein baton here. It's a treasure that I have. The next piece,
I've got one as well.
Okay. The Brahms Double Concerto, Isaac Stern, Leonard Rose, Eugene Ormandy, the Philadelphia Orchestra.
Well, several reasons. I mean, firstly, Brahms anyway is hugely important to me. I mean, it happened to be the first Brahms Second Symphony was the first piece when I joined the National Youth Orchestra of Great Britain. We played the Brahms Second, and it was the first time I'd ever played in anything but a tiny little school orchestra. And the sound of this was just so staggering. I was just in tears. I couldn't play the cello for 2 minutes. I don't know how many minutes at the beginning, you know, because the tears were just pouring down my cheeks because the sound was so unbelievable. But the reason I chose the Brahms double is because when I was studying at the Royal Academy of Music, with a violinist there, we performed the Brahms double. And I remember that being the greatest experience of my life as a player, to actually play the Brahms double concerto, where you're playing a concerto, but you're playing chamber music at the same time. You've got this extraordinary conversation between the violin and the cello, which is just so powerful and so moving and so beautiful. So I adore the piece. But then on top of that, because Isaac Stern was the person who saved Carnegie Hall, and his recording with Leonard Rose was a recording I had in my early teens, and I've played it for years and years, hundreds of times. I do think it's the greatest recording there is, and the way the two of them played together as well. I mean, they were just a perfect partnership. You know, the conversation. I mean, in other words, there's a resonance which travels in lots of directions in terms of my own personal life. So it represents a lot of things that matter to me.
I'm going to ask you a question I didn't plan, but came to mind. And if it's too personal, you don't want to address it, just say I don't want to address it. Maurice Janssens performed, I believe it was his last concert ever at Carnegie Hall. I happened to be there, and he was supposed to perform the next night, and he took ill at the performance, the first performance. Would you talk about his artistry? Many people I talk to say he was the greatest. I don't use the word greatest at all, but that there was something extraordinary about him.
Well, look, firstly, I adored Maurice. Huge respect for him. I think he was, you know, I don't use the word greatest either. I think there's no such thing as the greatest anything. But without question, he was one of the very greatest artists I've ever worked with. But he also, I mean, he was an extraordinarily humble man. Everything that mattered to him was about music, really. And I even remember, you know, just to fast forward to what happened the previous night, which was the first performance he did, and as that happened the last at Carnegie Hall. He looked exhausted. I mean, he really looked so drained. And in the intermission, he came backstage and he looked terrible. And so I called for a doctor. The doctor came to see him and said, "You cannot go back onto the platform." And so the doctor called the paramedics from the hospital, and they came in and they said, "You know, I'm sorry, we've got to take you straight to hospital. You cannot go." The minute they said that, he got up, walked out of the room, went to the elevator and went downstairs to conduct the second half of the concert. He would not let his audience down. I mean, this was typical of Maurice. He wouldn't let anybody down. He wouldn't let his players down. You know, Maurice had absolute loyalty. I mean, he was one of the most loyal people I've known in my entire life, as well as being one of the most humble and beautiful. I mean, he was a beautiful person. Yeah, so he went down. I went with the doctor. We had the manager of the orchestra. All of us were sitting in that little area just off the stage door, sitting there thinking this was going to be the first time in our life we're sitting at a concert and a conductor is going to die during the concert. Not only did he get through the Brahms Symphony, which was beautiful, he then came back, took his bows, and then we find he's gone back on again to do an encore. You know, completely insane. But Maurice, 100%. You know, then straight off to hospital. And when I spoke to him the next day, I mean, he was already feeling much better. And he said to me, Clive, there's only two things I care about in my life, or we care about in my life, and that is music and our little dog.
Oh.
And you know, he and his wife adored their little dog.
Yeah.
You know, but he, under no circumstances would he ever not have completed that concert unless he was dead. I mean, and that was just so completely and utterly who he was. And of course, he went back. I mean, he was feeling much better, but he went back and he died not that long afterwards.
Yeah.
But he will always be, for me, you know, one of the great people I've known in my entire life, and a truly, truly great artist. And he never stopped learning. I mean, the thing about Maris was he wanted to learn from everybody he talked to. You know, he'd want to explore, he'd want to learn. He'd never stop rehearsing. I mean, I think that's why orchestras loved him, because he was never satisfied. He always wanted to ensure tomorrow could be even better than today. So that was what his life was all about.
In your book, you quote Pablo Casals, who kept practicing at 95 because he finally felt he was getting pretty good at it, which I love. One of my mottos is Michelangelo's, who at 82 said, "Ancora imparo," I'm still learning. And I want to ask you in conclusion, I know we could do this for hours, and I am grateful for the time you've given us. You belong to a youth orchestra in Britain. Carnegie Hall has created the National Youth Orchestra of the United States, and NYO2, which is for younger people, often described as minority at risk, whatever term we use. I've seen these wonderful young artists come to New York. I wrote a program once for one of the programs, and it's incredibly impressive as part of Carnegie Hall's outreach. How do you create an orchestra? I know you've managed them, you have brought them into Carnegie Hall. This is creating an orchestra with a special mission. How does that happen?
Well, firstly, one of the things I couldn't believe when I got here was that there was no National Youth Orchestra of America. So this was something I knew we had to do. And so, you know, with the new head of education that I brought in shortly after I arrived, she was also very positive about the idea, but we had a lot of things we wanted to change, a lot of other things we wanted to do first. But then, you know, we did decide to go ahead, that the time was right to go ahead. And I mean, I knew a lot about youth orchestras, because not only had I been in the National Youth Orchestra, then subsequently, when I was managing the LSO, I was on the board of the National Youth Orchestra. So I knew a lot, she knew a lot, and we brought somebody in who had real expertise in that area to really put it together. So we had the right team to do this. And it was, you know, we wanted it to be 16 to 19-year-olds, the best in the country. Everybody had to audition every year. Just because you get in one year doesn't mean you should get in the next year, because at that age, people's focuses change. So there may be other things that mean they're not practicing enough or as much, and they wouldn't get in again. So, you know, we set a lot of criteria. We also agreed it should not be people who are already at music college, because they have all the opportunities anyway. So all of, you know, we set up all these criteria. We thought it was really important for it to tour on an annual basis, so that, you know, they would really act as youth ambassadors for their country around the world. I mean, that was something that was a minor part of what happened in Britain, but not a significant, not a central part. So, you know, there were lots of criteria we set. We thought it through very carefully, and then we launched it. And with Valery Gergiev going to Moscow, St. Petersburg, well, Kennedy Center first, then Russia, and then the Proms in London. And huge success. I mean, extraordinary level of playing in America, so colossal success. But one of the things we all were aware of was that there were a huge number of very talented young players who don't have opportunities. They don't necessarily have access to best teaching. Maybe their parents don't have the money. So we decided to create a younger orchestra to look after, you know, how do you enhance the pipeline, really, of people who have the opportunity to get into the National Youth Orchestra, and then obviously possibly music college, orchestras, and so on, so that you've got a much more representative group of people from across America. So that was a much tougher job. And the guy who runs the ensembles, I mean, he had to set something up where we were really proactively searching for the people with talent who hadn't had opportunities necessarily. And one of the fascinating things was, I mean, there were even some people who absolutely could have got into the National Youth Orchestra, but their assumption about themselves was they wouldn't have stood a chance, because they hadn't come from a background of support and either good teachers or parental support or whatever. It didn't occur to them they had the talent. So we found a lot of people for the younger orchestra. We started that 2 or 3 years later, and now a lot of them in this year. It won't actually happen physically, but I think 21 people had got in from National Youth Orchestra 2, the younger one, into National Youth Orchestra. And then 2 years ago, we started National Youth Orchestra Jazz, America's art form. And, we felt it was really important that we should do that. And jazz was always part of our concept from the very beginning. MYO2 wasn't. That was something that evolved out of the situation and our awareness, what we'd learned from MYO. So that all three ensembles have had a huge impact on music. And as I say, the standards in America are so high that, I mean, you listen to the National Youth Orchestra, the 16 to 19-year-olds, and you shut your eyes, you could be listening to a top orchestra. You open your eyes and they're kids. So, it's an astounding experience. And it's had that impact all around the world.
Another person who I know, who I think of you and I think of him as role models for me and people who I learn from, admire, is Dr. Joseph Polizzi, who recently retired as president of Juilliard after many years. And I met him because my dad was a trombonist, and when he died, my mother and I endowed a trombone scholarship at Juilliard, and there had not been one before that. And through that, I came to teach occasionally at Juilliard, and every year meet the recipient of the scholarship. I wanted no role in picking the winner, but I wanted to meet him and later her to discover who they were and tell them a bit about my father and his musicianship. Excuse me. And many of these young people came from, the backgrounds that you describe, where they never could imagine acceptance, inclusion, being part of a large, famous institution. How do we help creative people of all types overcome those feelings? That's a broad question, I know, but so much of what I encounter when I work with younger people is the feeling that I can't do this, I'm not good enough, or I won't be accepted, or I'm not the right color, or whatever. What do you think about that in terms of inspiring people to be their best?
Well, in the end, it goes all the way back, right the way to childhood. It's why we have such vast education programs. We're trying to engage for a very significant extent with kids who wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to be involved with music, engage with music, participate in music making. So what we do is very much geared to giving kids the opportunity, to giving kids the stimulus to ask questions, to be curious, to find out who they are. This is all a central part of what we're trying to achieve with all our education programs, which I said reach about 800,000 people a year now across America, most of them kids. And we'll continue to grow and expand this. And I mean, I think that, there's good things and bad things about the days we live in now, or the day we live in now. And that is, if I think back, and people say exactly the same about America, that, 40, 50 years ago, every child in school had the opportunity to learn an instrument. Exactly the same in Britain. No longer true. Relatively few do. So it's switched from governments, whether it be it local or national, taking responsibility for the role of the arts in the lives of us as human beings and in how we develop as human beings, from government to institutions and individuals. And my view is we're in transition. We do a vast amount. Different organizations do differing amounts. But I think ultimately we'll end up with a model that probably is more powerful than the original government model used to be, because you'll have all the people who will be involved on the teaching side and the engagement side will be people who care passionately about that art, which was not necessarily the truth when, it was simply something that was instituted by government. So I think ultimately we'll end up with a model which hopefully creates as close as possible to universal access and opportunity, because that is what we have to try and do. Obviously, Carnegie Hall cannot do it on its own, but we work with other people. We've got partnerships all around the country, and we'll continue to grow those. And the key thing being that every child should have the opportunity to have not just music, but the arts in general. It's a central part of how they grow up and how they find who they are as a human being, and find an outlet for their creativity. So, you know, I mean, hopefully we're moving to something that can be much more strong and resilient, because governments change their minds as well. I mean, that's what's hopeless about that side of things. You could have a government that has a huge commitment to the arts in schools, and then you find you've got to change and there's no commitment. So, you know, provision goes up and down. Whereas if it's provided institutionally and individually by artists and institutions who genuinely care and genuinely believe, there will also be sustainability about that. I mean, we should, of course, be working with government. Of course, government should have a role in this, but we can't assume they will. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. So we've got to do 100% of what we can possibly do. And if we've got a great partner in government, sometimes, it'll never be always, sometimes terrific, we'll all achieve a lot more. If we haven't, we'll still be doing something that really matters.
You know well that there is in America and India and certain places, the promotion of what's called STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. You, other people are promoters of STEAM education, where we add the letter A, arts, in there, because most people who study the arts don't wind up going into the arts. But the thinking process, the creative process that the arts offer will make them better scientists, technologists, engineers, and mathematicians. And you study math. So we know a lot about the connection between math and composers and musicology, music theory. I could ask you 1,000 questions, but I'm going to stick to two more only. One of the things apparently you began doing with the London Symphony, and you do in a grand, wonderful way at Carnegie Hall, are the festivals that happen each year. They're thematic festivals, whether it's Japan or Berlin or Venice. I was a Venetian history major, and you kindly had me speak before performance about Vivaldi. And in more recent years, it's not so much places and cultures, but ideas such as migration. This year was going to be, and I hope will be, Beethoven in honor of his anniversary, but not only. What I asked you a couple of years ago at the presentation about migration was, you had planned that 2 or 3 years before at least. And at that very moment, it was the national conversation. And obviously you couldn't have known, or perhaps you did, that it was going to be the national conversation. And you and I spoke about a book by Isabel Wilkerson about the great Negro migration. It was called Negro then, from the South to the North, warmed by other suns. It's a magnificent book. And when you conceive of a festival, what are the seedlings or the kindling that ultimately results in the big idea? And then how do you make it happen?
Well, firstly, we have lots of ideas. You know, and a lot of ideas that we won't use necessarily. You know, you always have to have far more ideas than you're ever going to use. One of the things that has lain behind a lot of the decisions we've made is, and again, that's obviously absolutely central to what's happening right now in America, has been our view that the situation regarding systemic racism in America, rooted in slavery 400 years ago, and essentially part of America's worst self-made problem, you know, is something we have to address. So right from the beginning, the first festival, you know, where we started with nothing was when I went to Jessie Norman and asked her to curate a festival celebrating African-American culture. And again, I mean, so addressing issues around Black history here, and the challenges and the appalling things that Black people have to contend with, has been the biggest single factor in the festivals we've done. Most of the time, we're just trying to look at what do we think are really important subjects that need to be addressed. So when we looked at migrations, the African American South to North, you know, from the early 1900s through the 70s, was a central part. And, you know, and equally, you know, looking at the festival we're doing next season, which is in print. I mean, whether we'll be able to do it is another matter. But the artists under oppression, Voices of Hope, the artists under oppression. Again, I mean, we're looking at various things, including the Holocaust, you know, many different things. But again, absolutely central to that is slavery. And the fact that artists, no matter how appalling the circumstances, and this is what this particular exploration is, no matter how appalling the circumstances, artists always have to create. And what they don't create is something that's, you know, they don't create something all about the agony and the misery and, you know, which is usually the, you know, what they're actually suffering and their people are suffering. They create things that create hope, opportunity, give people a sense of identity, a sense of self-worth. And, you know, so it's really uplifting and inspiring. So that is our next festival. So, you know, and again, I mean, future plans again include very strong emphasis on issues around African Americans and their experience in America. So we feel, you know, and this pervades a lot of the work we do in our education department. We do a lot of other things on the stage as well that reflect our commitment in this area. But the festivals are about exploring really important topics. And there's a degree to which important topics are always going to be topical. You know, so yes, you said the migrations one appeared prescient. I mean, the fact is we could have done it at almost any time and it would have been topical, you know, which, you know, is what we're trying to look at, is things that really need to be looked at, need to be addressed, need to be talked about, and actually need action.
And that's why STEAM and not STEM. My favorite example, I guess there are two, of artist and oppression. There are many, 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 but I will name two: Verdi's Nabucco, and the way it inspired a nation to throw out its occupiers from Austria, from France, elsewhere. And the other one is Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony. Absolutely. Which the whole story of that, it's too long to tell here now, but basically Arturo Toscanini, an anti-fascist, helped bring out through Norway these pieces that were photographed of the score, and it was put together here in New York and premiered in July of 1942 or 43 in Studio 8H by the NBC Symphony. It was NBC Symphony. And that was an extreme act of a cry of hope over oppression, because Leningrad was under a siege for 900 days. My final question, Clive, and as I said, maybe we can do another conversation some other time. You wrote in your book that there were three things you were good at: music, mathematics, and carpentry. Did you build the shelves behind you?
No, I didn't. I mean, when I first got married, I built everything in the house: wardrobes, shelves, you know, units, everything. But I don't do carpentry much anymore. But I did have an antique business for a number of years, and, you know, which we created. I mean, you know, me and my wife at the time, because I adored antique furniture. I loved doing restoration, and you know, it was whilst I was still a player, and I was actually getting quite frustrated with the lack of personal creativity involved in playing in an orchestra, which is a wonderful experience in many ways, but it does not create an outlet for personal creativity. So we created an antique business. I used to do all the buying and all the restoration. And so that was a part of my life. But the minute I went into management, we sold the business because I found there was so much more creativity in running an orchestra than running an antique business. So it ceased to be, you know, the love it was. I mean, it remains a love in terms of furniture. I shouldn't show you, I could show you around this room a bit. And there's one or two pieces of beautiful English furniture here. In fact, right behind me. Sorry, it's not quite behind, it's just there. Okay. But, you know, so there's still things that are a few memories of that part of my life. But for me, truly beautiful furniture is like a great painting is to somebody whose primary love is painting. I mean, the craftsmanship, the creativity, the beauty of that remains something that is a really important part of my life. And carpentry did play a part in my life, because I guess maybe even because I had an antique business in my later years as a cellist in the LSO, I suppose it's possible that the reason I was asked to stand in for 3 months whilst we found a manager initially was perhaps because they thought if I could run a business, I knew something about business. I mean, they happened to be wrong, but never mind.
My surname, Plotkin, is a very common surname in St. Petersburg, and it means carpenter or woodworker. And my family, they were Jews on the father's side, until my father, were all woodworkers. They made things for the Russian royal family. A lot of the woodwork that you
Wow.
see in houses in St. Petersburg is theirs. My father drew from the mother's side, which was the musical side. And I can't do a thing. I can't hammer a nail, but music is for all of us. Clive, thank you for everything you do, and thank you for educating me today, and as you do always, and for educating our listeners. And I look forward to seeing you soon in Carnegie Hall. Be well.
Well, Fred, thank you so much for inviting me. And as always, it's fascinating to